deposed and replaced on the throne by his nephew, Mehmed I. One of the many sultans to do so, Mehmed was forced to first calm the boiling tensions in his empire after his uncle's overthrow. After roughly a year, Sultan Mehmed was able to end the rebellion with the execution of Halil and a large portion of his supporters. During his reign, Mehmed became stuck in an on-and-off war with Persia, which brought about no real conclusion, whilst also being faced with more discord in Europe beginning in 1735. The new Russo-Turkish War began after Russia decided to sign the Treaty of Ganja with Iran, creating an alliance against the offensive Ottomans. The Russians now turned toward Crimea, which they continuously sieged, burning palaces and fortifications as they pushed deeper into the peninsula. They finally reached Azov, where they captured the Ottomans' fortress there. Although Russian goals were aggressive, all sides of the conflict were essentially subdued by a plague outbreak throughout 1737 to 1739. Still, Austria attempted to join the war against the Turks during 1737, but they faced repeated defeats at the hands of the Ottomans and eventually lost Belgrade after an incursion in the late summer of 1739. All three empires made negotiation efforts partway through the war, but no progress was made diplomatically. Russia continued to drive deeper into Ottoman territory through 1739, despite the fact that the Austrians seemed to have had enough. The same year, the Treaty of Belgrade was signed, ending the Austro-Turkish War and giving the Ottomans the Kingdom of Serbia, part of Banat, as well as handing over Oltenia over to the Ottoman vassal of Wallachia. Russia was eventually forced to sign the Treaty of Niš, roughly a month later, which ended their war with the Turks while allowing them to keep control of Azov. 6 years after peace was made with his European opponents, Sultan Mehmed died of natural causes and was succeeded by Osman III. Osman, son of Mustafa II, spent 51 years in captivity after his father's deposition and seemed to have developed some behavioral issues as a consequence. Potentially due to his unusual mind, Osman was not responsible for many significant changes or events in the empire's history. One of the peculiar modifications made during his reign was the banning of all music and musicians from his palace. Nonetheless, a more important action taken by Sultan Osman III was the declaration of the Firman in 1757 that preserved the division of responsibilities for various holy land sites between Christians, Jews, and Muslims. That same year, on October 30th, Osman passed away, leaving the Ottoman throne open to Mustafa III. Mustafa III was determined to create more solidity within the empire. He focused initially on issues with coinage, aqueducts, and other internal affairs, as well as spending a decent amount of time traveling to ensure that his laws were being enforced throughout his territory. Externally, Mustafa was determined to maintain peace with Europe. Despite pressure from Frederick the Great of Prussia to become more involved in European affairs, the Ottomans put great effort into remaining peaceful until war with Russia became inevitable once again. Russia's overbearing attitude toward Poland and Crimea became too much for the Ottomans, and another Russo-Turkish conflict erupted in 1768. The war was an embarrassing defeat for the Ottoman Empire, which was forced to give up territory, reparations, and allow the Russians to be protectors of Orthodox Christianity in the Ottoman vassal states of Wallachia and Moldavia in 1774. Although a treaty was signed in July, Sultan Mustafa III had actually died of a heart attack in January of 1774, which meant that the war was resolved under the reign of Abdul Hamid I. One of Sultan Abdul Hamid's priorities was to reform the Janissary Corps and all of the Ottoman armed forces, which he did. He is also credited with the establishment of the Imperial Naval Engineering School. Hamid further concentrated significant efforts on strengthening his grip over Syria, Egypt, and Iraq. While Russia was not one of Sultan Hamid's preferred focuses, he eventually was pushed back into war with the recurrent adversary in 1787, after Russia consistently abused their power as Orthodox Christianity's protector. The Turks were able to stand their ground fairly well at the start, but with Austria backing Russia, Hamid's troops began to struggle. Said to have been morally defeated by the ongoing war, Sultan Abdul Hamid died in April of 1789. Selim III took over the Ottoman throne and the continuing war with Russia. Shortly into his reign, Sultan Selim agreed to end yet again the Russo-Turkish War, despite having to accept the ultimate success of the Russians. Once the foreign conflict was settled, Selim set up a committee of reformers and series of reforms relating to taxation, land tenure, and provincial governorships. In addition to continuing the military reforms of his predecessor, Selim also opened Ottoman embassies throughout the European capitals in order to create better relations with the West. To round out the century, the Ottoman Empire was faced with an unexpected plot twist, as Napoleon invaded Egypt. Sultan Selim was forced to declare war on France and, unexpectedly, form an alliance with Great Britain and Russia. This new conflict would continue into the next century, marking yet another era of increasing change for the Ottoman Empire. The 19th century in the Ottoman Empire pushed the Turks into a position of desperate defensiveness and required the centuries-old conquering power to make alliances with unexpected nations in order to prevent collapse. Without a doubt, the 1800s marked a rapid decline for the Ottoman Empire, and through challenge after challenge at each sultan who would take the throne over the next 100 years. Going into the new century, Selim III was still the sultan of the empire. Recently, Napoleon and his French troops had taken power in Egypt and styled themselves as the liberators of Egypt from the Ottoman Empire, although constant revolts and discord back home in France forced Napoleon to make a subtle retreat before causing too much damage to the Ottomans. By 1801, the French officially pulled out of the territory, allowing Selim a sigh of relief, although the Ottoman Sultan actually had a strong respect for Napoleon himself. In 1804, France began attempting to win over Selim's support, whilst Russia wanted to keep the Ottomans leaning to their side. Napoleon himself even wrote to Sultan Selim, referring to him as Most High and Invincible Prince, the Great Emperor of the Muslims, and imploring him to explain why he would let the Russians influence his decision. The Frenchman also noted that he himself recognized the title of Emperor for Selim, so the Sultan should do the same for him in return. He lastly notes that the Russians have 15,000 men at Corfu, pointing out that those troops surely were there to oppose the Turks, and not the French. Selim truly wished to grant Napoleon the favor, but was too intimidated by the military might of the Russian-British alliance that faced the French. The Ottomans ultimately agreed to maintain a defensive alliance with Russia until 1806, at which point war broke out between the empires once again. The Russians were outraged by Selim's decision to depose his vassal states' Russophile governors in Moldavia and Wallachia. Meanwhile, within the empire, Selim was faced with rebellion from his Janissary and Yamak troops due to his new reformist policies. The Sultan was eventually ousted from the throne and put into prison in 1807. Mustafa IV was assigned as Selim's successor. An attempt was made by reformist supporters to reinstate Selim as Sultan. but Mustafa ordered his assassination before anything could be done. The new sultan's endeavors to undo his predecessor's reforms were cut short by Selim III's brother, Mahmud II, whose supporters quickly deposed Mustafa in July of 1808 and crowned Mahmud in his place. Sultan Mahmud II wished to continue the westernization reforms of his brother, but was first faced with more pressing matters. The war with Russia was only ended in 1812 with the Treaty of Bucharest, and the Ottomans were forced to give Bessarabia, or eastern part of Moldova, over to the Russians after facing demoralizing losses. The Serbian fight for autonomy shook the Balkans in 1815, and the Greeks were moving in the same direction themselves. In 1821, Greeks in the Morea revolted against Ottoman sovereignty, triggering the start of their war for independence. Also, a Romanian uprising existed at the same time. Sultan Mahmud initially called on the governor of Egypt for help, and the Ottomans were temporarily able to regain control until an alliance of Britain, France, and Russia routed the Ottoman-Egyptian coalition at the Bay of Navarino in October of 1827. Mahmud reacted by declaring war on Russia as the dispute with Greece continued. Another Russo-Turkish war waged on from 1828 through 1829, and the following year, the Ottoman Empire was forced to acknowledge Greek independence. In 1831, the governor of Egypt, Muhammad Ali Pasha, confronted Sultan Mahmud about a promise that had been made to him earlier, in which Mahmud agreed to make Ali the governor of Syria and Tarsus. Mahmud refused to follow through, and Ali reacted by sending troops under the command of his son, Ibrahim Pasha, to seize Damascus, Aleppo, and Konya, and then march towards Constantinople. Sultan Mahmud, who had stunningly sacked the entire Janissary Corps back in 1826, now had to seek aid from foreign powers. He first appealed to the British, who declined due to France's support of the Egyptians. Mahmud then turned to Russia, who agreed to an alliance. Still, the Egyptians routed the Ottoman forces at Nizip in June 1839, around the same time that Sultan Mahmud began the Tanzimat reform era, which brought about a more modernized and European-inspired Turkey. Before he was able to see the results of these changes, though, Mahmud II died of tuberculosis in the summer of 1839. Abdul Masih I replaced Mahmud as the new sultan and continued the increasing reforms within the empire. The year after the new young sultan took the throne, the Oriental Crisis of 1840 occurred during the ongoing Egyptian-Ottoman War, and the entirety of the Ottoman naval forces defected to Muhammad Ali and the Egyptian cause. France was ready to back the Egyptians, but Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia came to the Ottoman Sultan's aid. The European powers then established the Convention of London in July of 1840, promising the Egyptians territory in Sudan, Egypt, under the condition that those lands remain a part of the Ottoman Empire, though mostly as a formality. Muhammad Ali was hesitant to accept the deal, and turned to the French for support against it. But his once allies now switched sides in October of that year, triggering a military response against the Egyptians from the Ottomans and Europeans. Finally, Muhammad Ali agreed to his opponent's terms in November, giving up Syria, Adana, Crete, the Hijaz, and the Holy Land, in addition to handing the Ottoman naval forces back over to Sultan Abdul Masih. In 1853, the Ottoman Empire entered the Crimean War, yet another conflict with Russia. One of the main factors leading to the discord was further dispute surrounding the Russians' role as protectors of Orthodox Christianity in Ottoman vassal states. Britain and France quickly backed the Turks, fearing the growing power of the Russians. Meanwhile, Austria aligned once again with Russia. Eventually, though, Austria threatened to switch sides and back the Ottoman cause, forcing Russia to accept peace terms, resulting in the Treaty of Paris on March 30th, 1856. Just before the conclusion of the war, Sultan Abdul Majid issued the Hati Humayun, which established that all classes and ethnicities would be treated equally in all matters within the empire. In 1861, the Ottoman Sultan was pressured by the European powers into recognizing Lebanese autonomy and died shortly after from tuberculosis. Abdul Aziz became the next Sultan of the Ottoman Empire after the death of his brother. Sultan Abdul Aziz continued the reforms and westernization of Abdul Majid, taking significant advice from France on the establishment of a Council of State and public education system. The empire's first civil code was also promulgated during his reign. As tensions and rebellions rose in the Balkans, the Ottomans once again became unsatisfied with Russia, this time due to its support of the revolts from the Balkan states. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878 broke out, with Russia leading a coalition of Romanian, Bulgarian, Serbian, and Montenegrin troops. The conflict proved disastrous for the Ottoman Empire, ending in a decisive victory for Russia and its allies, the formal declaration of independence from Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro, the establishment of the Principality of Bulgaria, Austria-Hungary's occupation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Britain's seizure of Cyprus, all confirmed by the Congress of Berlin in 1878. Furthermore, just before the main portion of the war had erupted, Sultan Abdul Aziz had actually been dethroned by his own ministers due to a plethora of frustrations within the empire. This meant that Sultan Abdul Hamid II would be responsible for handling the resolution of the Balkan unrest. Initially, Murad V had taken the throne in Abdul Aziz's place, but he was deposed after 93 days due to accusations that he was mentally ill and unfit for the job. One of Sultan Abdul Hamid's initial actions was to promulgate the first Ottoman constitution in 1876, although it only lasted for 2 years before the Sultan suspended it in 1878. Over the next few years, France extended their reach into Tunisia, and Britain came to power in Egypt in 1882, prompting the Ottomans to look toward Germany for friendship, around which time the Greco-Turkish War was sparked in 1897 by the disagreement between the Ottomans and Greeks as to whether Crete should remain under the Ottoman Empire or unite with Greece. Germany, Austria-Hungary, France, Italy, Russia, and Britain all backed the Ottomans and wished to maintain peace in Crete. The war was short-lived and a defeat for Greece, which was forced to pay heavy reparations and allow Crete to remain an autonomous state under Ottoman suzerainty. Though Sultan Abdul Hamid II and his forces were undeniably victorious against the Greeks in Crete, the issue would continue into the next century. Additionally, unrest in the Balkans was far from over as the 1800s came to a close. Problems with Armenia and its neighbors began in the 1890s and only grew with time, as the Ottoman Empire was pushed more and more in the direction of urgent defense over its dwindling power and territory, a fall from grace that would only get worse in the years to come. The 20th century for the Ottoman Empire was marked, or more accurately, scarred, by one thing: collapse. Turkey's conquering power from the past 600 years would finally come to a humiliating end, with the whole world watching. The sick man of Europe would be unable to overcome the devastation brought by the Balkans wars and events to follow. The first domino to fall was actually prior to the Balkan Wars and is known as the Young Turk Revolution. The Young Turks, alongside other reformist groups making up the Committee of Union and Progress, was a movement established by groups of young university students, in favor of once again establishing a constitutional monarchy like the one that the Sultan Abdul Hamid II had established in 1876 and abolished 2 years later. As the Ottomans were pushed more and more into a defensive stance against the rest of Europe's powers, many of the young Turks and other Unionist reform supporters became further concerned with preserving their state. When the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907 occurred, the Ottoman reformists felt that there was a potential for the diplomacy to extend into a partition of Ottoman-controlled Macedonia. Finally, in July of 1908, the revolution broke out, led by Unionists such as Major Ahmed Niazi, Ayub Sabri, and Ismail Enver, and began to put heavy pressure on the Sultan to end his absolute rule and reinstate the constitution. Given the amount of support within the Ottoman military and the weak state of Abdul Hamid's rule, the revolution ended on July 24th, with the Sultan capitulating and restoring a constitutional monarchy. The Ottoman government now underwent a significant change, and a general election took place in November of 1908. The Committee of Union and Progress, or CUP, had great success and, as did many other former movements, established new political parties, such as the Freedom and Accord Party or the Ottoman Socialist Party. The new system was messy, and many of the incoming politicians were working-class people with no experience running a government. Meanwhile, Sultan Abdul Hamid II had been able to maintain his title under the terms that his position was basically only symbolic. Matters were complicated in 1909, though, when the Sultan stirred up the Ottoman counter-coup with his promises to restore the Ottoman Caliphate and Sharia legal system if his autocratic power was restored. Despite the fair amount of support, the counter-coup was quickly quelled after a short stint of control in Istanbul from Sultan Abdul Hamid's supporters. The Young Turk government was restored, and the Sultan was ultimately deposed and replaced by Mehmed V in a purely symbolic role. As stability within the empire continued, conflict in the Balkans suddenly skyrocketed. The Christians of Macedonia, including Serbs, Bulgarians, Vlachs, and Greeks, in addition to the Albanians, were heavily dissatisfied with the neglect they felt that they had received from the new Ottoman government, which was overly focused on centralized control. In 1912, the First Balkan War broke out with a declaration of war on Turkey by Montenegro on October 8th. The contestants of the conflict consisted of the Balkan League on one side, made up of Serbia, Bulgaria, Montenegro, and Greece, against the weakened Ottoman Empire. While Russia was not directly involved in the discord, they did give their favor to the Balkan League, which aimed to seize Macedonia from the Ottomans with their 750,000-strong army. The struggle was really only such for the Ottomans, as the Balkan coalition utterly routed their opponent on every front. All while the Balkan conflict carried on, the Ottomans were actually also locked into the Italo-Turkish War that started in 1911, after Italy demanded that the Turks give them territories in North Africa. The Ottomans refused, but Italy took the territories by force rather easily, stripping the Ottomans of some of their only remaining African possessions. Italy gained today's Libya and the Dodecanese Islands. The collapsing Ottoman Empire stood no chance against the allied Balkan powers, and by December 3rd, both sides were ready for an armistice. A brief revival of the conflict came after the coup in January of 1913, raiding the Sublime Porte and the government buildings and empowering the triumvirate of the three pashas. A peace treaty was finally signed in London 4 months later and officially stripped the Ottomans of almost every European territory they had left, including Albania, which would become independent, and Macedonia, which would be split between the Balkan nations. Although the Turks were not extensively involved in the Second Balkan War, which came as a consequence of disorder between Romania, Serbia, Greece, and Bulgaria about the borders of their new Macedonian possessions, they did use the opportunity to retake Adrianople in a violation of their previous armistice with Bulgaria. In 1914, general elections now confirmed the CUP's authority, and the Ottoman imperial government was established in January of that year. Although going into the First World War, the three pashas would remain the de facto rulers of the new military regime in the empire. On October 28, 1914, the Ottoman Empire officially entered World War I after signing the Turco-German alliance back in August of the same year. The friendly relations between Germany and Turkey played a significant role in the empire's entry into the war, in addition to Turkish opportunism and dislike of the Triple Entente nations. Germany had previously sent a military mission to Turkey, in which the Ottoman army and navy were organized under the leadership of Liman von Sanders, and greatly solidified the alliance between the involved authorities. The Germans also hoped that the Ottoman decision to join the side of the Triple Alliance would encourage Balkan states, such as Bulgaria, to support their cause as well. Meanwhile, the Turkish ambassador in Paris, Rifat Pasha, warned Enver Pasha, the Minister of War, not to join either side, as he believed that both alliances had the potential to shatter what little strength the empire had left. Enver Pasha, on the other hand, was unfazed, and insisted that the early victories of Germany proved that they would be on the winning side of the war. The earliest military action taken by the Ottomans during the First World War was an attack on Russia's Black Sea coast that triggered a quick response and declaration of war from Russia, Great Britain, and France. From there, the Ottoman Empire mostly fought within the Middle Eastern and Balkan theaters, and achieved significant victories near the start of the war, such as that at the Battle of Gallipoli. As the Turks were busy fighting on the world stage, they also faced revolts and a growing uprising from the local Arab territories. The decline of the empire was put on fast forward, and they were now facing offensive attacks from every possible angle, although Enver Pasha maintained a stance of triumph nonetheless, insisting that the Ottomans must remain in the war to assist their allies, going as far as claiming to have contributed to the Russian collapse and revolution in 1917. Still, when Bulgaria was forced into an armistice after a successful offensive by the Allies at the Macedonian front, the Ottomans were put in an impossible position without the Bulgarians' assistance. Subsequently, after multiple visits to their partners, the Ottomans' Grand Vizier, Talat Pasha, concluded that he and his ministry must resign in order to gain milder terms from the Triple Entente if the war-starting administration was no longer in control. Ahmed Izzet Pasha took the role of the Grand Vizier and quickly entered peace negotiations with the British, who were eager to come to terms with the Ottomans and exclude the French and Americans from any benefits it may bring about. The Armistice of Mudros was then signed on October 30th, 1918, ending Turkish involvement in the war. Unfortunately for the Ottoman Empire, the armistice not only failed to bring true peace, but it also marked the final leg of decline. With Enver Pasha's administration, himself included, no longer in power, the government was an unstable mess. Violence began to break out as law and order broke down, and the Western Allies began to march into Constantinople under the claim that they needed to restore harmony throughout Anatolia. Given that the Armistice of Mudros had allowed for the Allied powers to invade if a need to restore order was present, there was not much that the feeble Ottoman authority could do to stop them. The occupation of Constantinople lasted until the Treaty of Sèvres was signed on August 10, 1920, which gave the European allies control over Turkey's finances, a limit on their military numbers, and a significant amount of territory loss for the Ottomans. The Ottoman Empire, which was soon to be abolished, had to relinquish all right to North Africa and Arab Asia, and the empire was partitioned between Greece, Armenia, France, Italy, and Britain. To complicate matters, though, the treaty was never ratified due to an increasing nationalist movement throughout Turkey, leading to the Turkish War of Independence and the creation of the Grand National Assembly, which fought on one side of the war against the Sultan and the Western Allies. With the additionally unstable Russia backing the Turkish nationalists in hopes of developing a new communist ally and keeping the rest of Europe distracted from their own chaos, the revolutionaries were able to conclude a series of peace talks, ending in the Treaty of Kars, the Armistice of Madanya, and the ultimate destruction of the Ottoman Sultanate, and the empire in its entirety. The final sultan, Mehmed VI, left for exile on November 17, 1922, officially ending the collapse of one of the world's largest and long-lived empires in history. Under Mustafa Kemal, Turkey managed to regain territories in Anatolia and become independent. The new Turkish government earned international recognition through the following Treaty of Lausanne in the summer of 1923, officially replacing the Ottoman Empire with the Republic of Turkey. The history of the Ottoman Empire is vast and more than interesting, starting even before the Sultanate itself, with the arrival of the Turkish tribes of Anatolia, the Battle of Manzikert, the creation of various sultanates, and then the start of the Ottoman dynasty. This empire that existed for 600 years dominated its neighbors, won battles and wars, expanded quickly, and became a predator in this part of the world, achieving great success. But, as history has always shown us since the beginning of time, that every action has a reaction, every day becomes night, and every empire has its downfall.